If you are listening to this at night, do not pause the recording. Not because anything will happen to you, because the moment the sound stops, you will notice how much your room was moving before you heard it. Most people think silence is empty. It isn't. Silence is what remains when something finishes adjusting itself. I learned that 3 weeks ago, and distance did not help. Welcome to the Cabin Archive. These recordings document nights spent in locations where space behaves incorrectly once it is no longer observed. Everything you hear is described exactly as it was experienced. I did not come here to rest. I told people that because it sounds reasonable. A cabin in the woods, no reception, no interruptions. Somewhere a person goes when they want quiet, but quiet was never the point. I needed distance from the sense that rooms were continuing after I stopped looking at them. It began in my apartment. I woke during the night with the clear awareness someone had just left my bedroom. No footsteps, no door, just the certainty of absence, like air settling after being displaced. I checked the entire place, windows locked, door locked, nothing missing. But the room disagreed with my conclusion. The feeling stayed as if my awareness had arrived too late to witness something finishing. Every night it repeated, not a presence, a departure. Something always seemed to have just stopped being there the moment I noticed the room. Eventually, I stopped turning on lights because they never changed anything. Looking directly at the space normalized it, but relaxing brought the sensation back. Awareness interrupted it. After 10 nights, I rented the cabin. I chose the furthest one available and drove without music so my mind could not anchor to familiar sound. When the road narrowed into trees, pressure in my head equalized slightly, not relief, just less resistance. The cabin is small, one main room, a kitchen space, a hallway to a bedroom and bathroom. Old wood but maintained. It smells like warm dust rather than decay. There's a fireplace prepared and a cassette player with unlabeled tapes on a shelf. I did not play them. Night arrives quickly here. Darkness does not fade in, it replaces. The windows stopped reflecting sky and began reflecting the room before I noticed sunset. I expected the feeling to disappear. Instead, it became clear. In the apartment, noise diluted it. Here, silence has nothing competing with it. Silence is occupied by whatever continues when sound leaves. The first night passed without event, or I slept through it. Morning felt normal enough to believe distance worked. The second night I stayed awake longer. The fire burned low, and the cabin settled with predictable wooden clicks. Then I realized I had stopped blinking. There was no discomfort. I simply did not want to close my eyes because I understood the room would continue without me. Not change. Continue. I forced myself to blink. Nothing happened, yet the sense remained that I had interrupted something by doing it. The third night I turned the chair toward the wall and faced away from the room while the fire burned behind me. If the sensation depended on sight, removing sight should end it. It did not. The space behind me began organizing, not moving, not shifting, arranging. I could feel the center of the room without turning around. The certainty you feel when someone stands close behind you before hearing them. After 10 minutes I looked. The room was normal. I checked every corner again, even though I already knew what I would find. Nothing out of place, nothing moved, nothing disturbed. My reaction was always larger than the evidence. The fourth night I tried preventing it. Before the sensation could form, I spoke continuously and described everything I could see. Table, window, floor, fireplace, door, ceiling, walls. I kept naming objects so my attention never relaxed. While I spoke, the feeling never fully appeared. The moment I stopped, it returned slowly, like pressure filling a sealed container. That was when I understood it was not attached to a location. It was attached to the absence of observation. Something about unobserved space was incorrect. I slept with the lights on and dreamed of rooms remaining perfectly still while I watched them. But the instant I turned away, I could hear calm activity resume behind me. Not frantic movement, not panic, routine continuation. Morning brought enough confidence to test memory. The chair I had faced toward the wall was angled slightly toward the center of the room. Not enough to accuse certainty, but enough that I straightened it and scratched a small mark into the floor beside one leg using a key. I left the cabin for a walk longer than necessary. I wanted time away, so returning would feel like entering a place unused for hours. When I came back, the chair still aligned with the scratch. Relief lasted until I noticed the fireplace poker leaning against the opposite side of the brick. Then I remembered placing it. I was not completely certain, so I did not adjust it. I simply memorized it carefully. That night I avoided the chair entirely and sat on the bed in the other room. If the main room was the focus, distance within the cabin might matter. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Then I noticed I could feel the center of the main room from down the hallway. The same awareness as before, like knowing where a person stands in darkness, except there was no sound and no weight to justify it. I stepped into the doorway but did not look directly inside. The sensation intensified as if proximity strengthened it. My chest tightened without fear, more like anticipation I did not share. I looked quickly. Normal. I waited in the doorway until my eyes watered and the feeling faded again. The instant I turned back toward the bedroom, it returned behind me with more certainty than before. I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it. The wood between me and the room felt thin in a way thickness should not feel. Not fragile, just insufficient. I opened the door immediately. Normal again. That was the first time I considered the possibility that the room was not changing when unobserved. It was resuming. The next night I set the cassette player on the table and pressed play without checking the tape. Static filled the cabin, low constant hiss, nothing else. For as long as the sound continued, the sensation weakened. Not gone, just distant, like trying to feel a vibration through thick gloves. When the tape reached its end and clicked off, the feeling returned instantly and stronger than it had yet been. My hands moved before thinking and I rewound the tape. The hiss pushed it back again. Sound did not stop it, but it interrupted whatever required silence to continue. I left the tape running while I slept. I dreamed less that night. In the morning, the tape had finished and the player was off. The cabin felt heavier in a way I could not measure. I turned the tape over and pressed play again before making food. While eating, I realized I had not blinked for several seconds, and the sound had been masking the moment the feeling began building again underneath it. It was learning the pattern as quickly as I was. I stopped treating sleep as rest and started treating it as absence. The problem only developed when my awareness loosened, so I reduced the time it had access to that condition. I stayed awake most of the next day and let the tape play continuously. The hiss blended into the background until I could almost ignore it, but the moment I began to forget it was there, the sensation started building underneath, patient and consistent. I walked outside repeatedly, thinking open space might remove boundaries the feeling depended on. The forest did not help. The same awareness gathered in the air behind me between trees exactly as it did between walls. Distance from structure did nothing. Only attention changed it. By evening, exhaustion forced me back inside. The cabin looked ordinary in a way that felt intentional, as if normal appearance was the surface layer of something maintaining itself just out of direct inspection. I decided to test a simple rule. I would keep my eyes on the center of the room for as long as physically possible. I sat in the chair facing forward and stared without moving. Minutes passed. The fire lowered into embers. My eyes burned, but I continued. Nothing happened while I watched. Then I noticed the edges of the room becoming difficult to remember while I stared at the center. Not visually fading, but mentally unstable. The corners felt less certain than the point I focused on. When I shifted my attention slightly toward a wall, the previous area regained solidity and the new area felt unstable instead. It was not the room changing. It was whatever I was not directly observing becoming undefined. I blinked. The sensation surged so suddenly my hands gripped the chair arms. Not movement, not sound, but the overwhelming certainty something had just completed a motion the instant I lost continuous observation. I stood and checked every object again. Nothing visibly changed. The scratch on the floor still aligned with the chair leg. I sat again and stared at a different point. The same effect repeated. The unfocused areas felt ready, like held breath waiting for release. I realized I could predict the moment it would intensify, not time-based, attention-based. The longer I held focus on one location, the stronger the awareness grew everywhere else. Near midnight, I tested the opposite. I deliberately closed my eyes and counted slowly. Before reaching 3, the certainty became unbearable. Not fear, pressure. The knowledge the room was actively continuing in multiple directions simultaneously without me. I opened my eyes and the pressure stopped instantly. I laughed once out of disbelief, and the sound felt intrusive, like speaking during a conversation already in progress that paused only because I had spoken. The tape hiss continued beside me, but it no longer pushed the sensation back as effectively. It still weakened it, but not as much as before. I left the tape running and lay down. Sleep came in short segments, separated by sudden waking. Each time with the conviction I had just interrupted coordinated activity in the room. Morning light did not remove it anymore. Day only made it quieter. By the 6th day, I understood the pattern well enough to stop doubting it. The room did not wait for darkness. Night only made it easier to notice. The behavior depended entirely on whether I maintained continuous awareness of it. I tried dividing my attention across the entire room at once. Instead of focusing on a single point, I relaxed my eyes and attempted to observe everything simultaneously. For a few seconds, it seemed to work. The pressure lessened and the cabin felt still. Then the opposite occurred. Because I was not truly observing any specific place, the entire room felt equally unobserved. The sensation rose everywhere at the same time and stronger than before. I focused on the door handle to stabilize it. Immediately, the area behind me felt active. I focused on the fireplace. The hallway became uncertain. There was no winning configuration. Observation only paused one location while transferring continuation to another. I began keeping a written record on paper, not to remember events but to anchor attention. The act of writing forced my awareness into a narrow channel and reduced the buildup. Whenever I stopped writing, the pressure returned within seconds. Several hours passed this way. Write, pause, feel it gather, write again. Near evening, my hand cramped and I set the pen down. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The bedroom door behind me was now slightly open. I had closed it earlier and placed a shoe against it to confirm position. The shoe remained in place, but the door rested lightly against it, as if moved carefully until resistance was met. I stared at the gap for a long time. No sound came from inside the room, no air movement, only the understanding that whatever resumed in unobserved space no longer required the entire room. A smaller space was enough. I stood and pushed the door closed fully. The sensation lessened the moment the gap disappeared. I did not leave it again. That night I moved the chair so I could see both the main room and the hallway simultaneously. It forced an uncomfortable angle, but reduced the feeling to a manageable level. Around what I estimate was after midnight, I experienced the first direct contradiction of memory. The cassette player stopped. I was certain I had rewound it minutes earlier. I remember the sound of the mechanism and the hiss returning. Now it was silent. The pressure surged so violently my ears rang. I rewound the tape again and pressed play. The hiss returned, and the sensation retreated, but not fully. I checked the tape counter and saw it near the end position. I did not remember listening that long. I stayed awake until morning without looking away from the room long enough to allow another lapse. When daylight came, I found additional pages written in my notebook in handwriting similar to mine but not words I remembered forming. They described the room as calm when I slept. I read the lines repeatedly, hoping recognition would appear. The handwriting matched my pressure patterns and spacing, but the phrasing was wrong. I do not describe things as calm. I describe them as normal or unchanged. Calm implies activity capable of disturbance. The sentences stated the room continued efficiently during my absence. I tried recalling writing them and could not find the memory, only the certainty I had remained awake most of the night. There were short gaps where I must have closed my eyes, but not long enough to fill several paragraphs. I tore the pages out and set them in the sink. For the rest of the day, I avoided the bedroom entirely and kept both doors open so no enclosed space could exist unobserved. The feeling weakened but did not disappear. Instead, it spread evenly through the cabin, less intense but constant, like background pressure. I considered leaving and ending the recording, but the drive here had taken hours and the nearest town even longer on foot. More importantly, I understood distance had never solved it before. Changing buildings only changed how clearly I noticed it. I decided to remove sleep completely for one night and document every minute. By evening, my hands trembled slightly from fatigue and caffeine. I positioned the chair to view the majority of the cabin and placed reflective surfaces so remaining blind spots were minimized. The effect resembled trying to watch a room using fragments rather than vision. For a while it worked. Then the reflections began creating uncertainty instead of clarity. Seeing the same space indirectly felt insufficient. The pressure built faster in reflected areas than in direct sight. I covered the reflections. Near midnight, the sensation stabilized into a steady weight behind perception. Not pulses anymore, not sudden surges. Continuous. I realized the pattern had changed again. The room no longer required a lapse to continue. It only required reduced certainty. I spoke constantly to maintain it, describing objects, temperatures, positions, anything to keep my awareness anchored. Hours passed this way. Sometime later, I noticed the fire had burned lower than expected. I did not remember adding wood, yet fresh logs were present among the embers. I checked the wood box. Several pieces were missing. I had no memory of standing or moving. I remained in the chair. The notebook lay open on the table. New writing filled the page describing routine maintenance of the environment while I rested. I was not resting. I closed the notebook and did not open it again. After that, I stopped trying to prove whether I was moving without memory. The evidence no longer mattered. The pattern was consistent. Whenever my awareness loosened, the environment behaved as though it expected continuity. I removed the mattress from the bedroom and dragged it into the main room so there would be only one space to monitor. The hallway felt less oppressive once nothing remained beyond sight, but the pressure condensed into the single room instead of dispersing. I kept the tape running constantly. When it clicked off, I rewound it immediately. The hiss had become less of a barrier and more of a warning. The moment I noticed it fading into the background, I knew my attention was slipping. Late into the night, I tested something simple. I stared at the cassette player itself instead of the room. Within seconds, the rest of the cabin felt active, the strongest yet, as if focusing on an object allowed the surrounding space full freedom. I shifted my gaze back to the center of the room, and the sensation lessened. Objects were not the trigger. Boundaries were. I placed my hand flat against the table and closed my eyes while maintaining physical contact. The pressure built slower than before. Touch anchored awareness better than sight alone. I kept my hand there for several minutes. Then I realized I could feel faint vibrations through the wood not produced by the fire or my movement. Soft repeating motions spaced evenly apart. Not footsteps, not mechanical, coordinated. I opened my eyes and the vibration stopped instantly. I tried again and the same thing occurred. Eyes closed, motion beneath the table. Eyes open, stillness. I left my hand in place while keeping my eyes open. Nothing. It required the absence of observation, not simply the absence of vision. Near what I believe was morning, I heard the cassette player click off, but did not move to rewind it immediately. I wanted to measure the delay before the pressure surged. There was no delay. The certainty filled the room instantly and completely, stronger than any previous night. My ears rang and my chest tightened as if the air itself were occupied. Without looking away from the room, I reached toward the player and pressed rewind by touch alone. The hiss returned and the pressure reduced, but did not leave entirely. Something had accelerated. I understood then the tape was not preventing it. It was giving me time to notice it. The cabin did not become active when I stopped observing. It had always been active. Once I accepted that, the fear changed into a different problem. If activity never stopped, then sleep did not create it. Sleep only removed my ability to interrupt it. I no longer tried to remain fully alert. Instead, I tried to observe the transition itself. The exact moment my awareness faded. I sat upright in the chair and allowed my eyes to rest without fully closing. The room blurred slightly but remained visible. I focused on the edge of losing concentration rather than fighting it. For a while, nothing happened. Then I felt it. Not in the room first, but in my posture. My shoulders adjusted subtly as if aligning more comfortably than I intended. My breathing slowed into a rhythm I had not chosen. I forced a deeper breath, and it immediately corrected back to my pattern. I relaxed again. The slower rhythm returned. The room was not waiting for me to stop observing it. It was waiting for me to match it. I stayed perfectly still and allowed my attention to soften just enough to feel the edge without crossing it. The pressure in the room did not surge this time. It stabilized. Minutes passed. My hand moved slightly across the armrest. I had not decided to move it. I lifted it, and the sensation sharpened again. I lowered it gently and allowed the same position to return. The pressure eased. I understood then the continuation I sensed each night was not separate from me. The environment was not resuming activity alone. It was including me in it whenever I stopped directing myself. I stood up abruptly and the feeling spiked hard enough to make my vision narrow. The fire crackled loudly as if the sound had been suppressed before. I paced the room, speaking out loud to reassert control over my own movement. The pressure followed, but weaker, while I actively chose motion. When I stopped walking, the alignment sensation returned immediately. Subtle adjustments in posture, breathing, even the angle of my head. I picked up the notebook and held the pen above the page without touching it. My hand began lowering slowly. I dropped the pen. The pressure surged and faded repeatedly, not random, almost corrective. I left the notebook closed after that. I stayed awake until daylight again, but morning no longer reset anything. Light only made it easier to see the positions I was being guided toward. I tested small movements. If I resisted them, the pressure increased. If I allowed them, it reduced. Not comfort, not relief, correction. I began choosing deliberately incorrect positions and holding them. The sensation intensified until maintaining the posture became physically difficult, as though balance itself disagreed. When I relaxed, my body returned to a neutral stance and the room felt quiet again. That was when I understood the last part. The room was not changing to match me. I had been changing to match it. Sleep was simply the longest period I stopped resisting. I packed my things immediately after that realization. The feeling followed, but weaker outside the cabin. Still present, just less precise, like a signal losing clarity with distance. Before leaving, I turned off the cassette player and waited. The pressure rose once more, steady and patient, but I kept moving and stepped outside into open air. The forest felt wider than before, yet not empty. I locked the door and walked down the road without looking back because I knew the sensation depended on attention. It has not stopped since I returned home. Rooms feel comfortable faster now when I remain still long enough. Breathing settles on its own if I allow it. Sometimes at night I wake already facing the center of the room. I no longer believe the cabin was unique. It was simply quiet enough to notice. If you are listening to this while resting, You may want to move slightly now just to confirm you decided to. If you did not, do not worry. It becomes easier once you stop interrupting it. Our story comes to an end tonight, so I'll let the fire burn out. Good night. I'll see you next time.